Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast, where we explore the gospel that Jesus' earliest disciples heard and what the last several decades of historical studies have clarified about this first century Jewish message.
Listeners, welcome back to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. I'm Josh Hawkins, and I'm here with Bill Schofield and with John Harrigan. Howdy, guys. How's it going?
Hey, good.
Good to be here again.
Yep.
Always great to be with you, listeners. We hope that you enjoyed our Q&A last week. We got to as many questions as we could. There's lots that you submitted, and we definitely will plan for another Q&A episode in the future, so please continue to send in your questions. Now, the week before that, we were teaching about Abraham and faith and eternal life. And in that episode, we looked a lot at 4th Ezra, the Apocalypse of Abraham, and 2nd Baruch, some Second Temple literature, where Abraham clearly was looking forward to the future restoration of Israel. We took some time to talk about the Akedah and the binding of Isaac and how the idea of faith was developed in that context as well, and how faith was framed around the Akedah and Abraham's expectation of a future restored Jerusalem. And I think it is always worth repeating in each of these episodes that we're doing here on the Tanakh. The point and the premise of this entire season is how the material in the Tanakh is understood by Second Temple authors and the authors of the New Testament, because it undergirds the apocalyptic framework for the scriptures. And this is what we want to continue to develop today, specifically around Isaac and Jacob and the 12 sons of Jacob, the 12 patriarchs. So how is this specific material in the Torah understood and used by the Second Temple authors? This is what we want to spend some time getting into today.
Yeah, I think it's an important conversation to just keep reiterating because like Matthias Henze points out in his book Mind the Gap, so much of the language in the New Testament, you can't just flip back from Matthew and find all of the language, right? It's just not there.
Right.
And so you can do one of two things with that, right? You can just decide what you think it means, and you attribute that meaning across the various New Testament texts. And then eventually what you'll end up doing is you'll end up playing it back over the Tanakh as well. Or if there just happens to be a body of literature between the writing of the Tanakh and 400 years later when the birth of Jesus happened, and all of the language, you can find it there. You can find not only the language, but the development of the concepts. So that's the other alternative, is that you look for it there, and when you find it, you go, oh, that's the conversation they're having. And that's all we're trying to do, is we're just saying, like, you can't unsee history. Once you look at history, like, things just make a heck of a lot more sense. And that's what we're hoping to do, is to inspire some clarity, and that ultimately that it would inspire some faith.
It's like Henze's classic example, right? When he says, well, where do rabbis and synagogues come from? You know, if you open up Matthew and start reading about rabbis and synagogues, you can't rewind and turn back a few pages to Malachi or anywhere else in the Tanakh and find rabbis and synagogues. Yeah. So where did those come from, right? And so exactly, Bill, this is what we intend to do today by looking at, again, Second Temple literature, this body of literature that sets up the context for the language in the New Testament.
Yeah, so this week we're going to look at kind of the end of Genesis and the rest of the patriarchs, Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 sons, which play prominent in Jewish apocalyptic literature. Generally, Isaac and Jacob they're dealt with in threes. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob are talked about together. And there's not a lot that is particular to Isaac and Jacob, except for 4th Ezra 6, which we wanted to look at just because it's a pretty awesome example of reading the apocalyptic framework into the historical narrative of Genesis. And so Ezra asks the angel, he says, I answered and said, what will be the dividing of the times, or when will be the end of the first age and the beginning of the age that follows? He said to me, from Abraham to Isaac, because from him were born Jacob and Esau. For Jacob's hand held Esau's heel from the beginning. For Esau is the end of this age, and Jacob is the beginning of the age that follows. For the beginning of a man is his hand, and the end of a man is his heel. Between the heel and the hand, seek for nothing else, Ezra.
That's awesome.
So you have a totally non-apocalyptic text being read apocalyptically, which is, totally out of historical context, but it gives a feel for how they're taking, everything and pushing it to its ultimate end.
Right, because all the text is really trying to say is that it's coming quickly. Like it's immediately after. Like there's nothing between Jacob's hand and Esau's heel. So that's how quickly the age to come is going to be inaugurated.
Right.
And it's not like a long drawn out thing, but it's like you said, it's kind of, they take familiar stories and they insert it with the kind of like this apocalyptic, what they're trying to say, like give this apocalyptic insight, but it's through something that originally is totally non-apocalyptic. It's just a story.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah, guys, that's great. Well, today, we want to spend most of today's episode looking at passages in a work called The Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. This is an apocryphal work that really gives us a clear picture of Jewish eschatology around the time of the Maccabean Revolt. Now, if you're not familiar with the Maccabean Revolt, it was an insurgency or an uprising among the Jews that took place a little over 150 years before the time of Jesus. And as we've mentioned before, just like other Second Temple literature, you can find the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs in the common translations of Second Temple lit by R.H. Charles and James Charlesworth. But as we'd expect at this point, just like we saw in 4th Ezra, I think we're going to see a lot of familiar language about the two ages, like this age and the age to come, the day of judgment, the resurrection of the dead, all the common themes in Jewish apocalyptic.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, like Josh said, so this is and to clarify, we're talking about the testament of the 12 patriarchs, not to be confused with the testaments of the 3 patriarchs.
Much later work, yeah.
Of the Ethiopian church.
And it's lame. So
it is.
So the reason like something like this is helpful, like, and where we're kind of spending most of the episode just kind of looking at that moment in time, which is about 150 years. But, well, scholars differ, between 150 to 130 years before the birth of Jesus, somewhere around there. And because it gives a real window of how, amidst a bunch of up and downs politically and religiously, so with the religious leadership and with the political leadership, so many ups and downs, and what at least some Jewish leaders are trying to put the hope of their people in to survive all of the ups and downs. And so the language and some of the concepts that are going to develop in this time, or that are already developed and that they're using by this time, I think we'll find they're extremely helpful for how Jesus and the apostles are encouraging disciples then to think about the world. So like a lot of it, and the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs is essentially a playing off of Genesis 49:1. And Genesis 49:1 is when Jacob sits down to bless all of his sons. And he says, I'm going to tell you all what's going to befall you in the latter days. The Hebrew is Acharit Hayumim, the days of the end, the furthermost days. And so especially if you're are in an apocalyptic context, words like that in the Tanakh are if you can get apocalyptic message from Jacob and Esau and the heel, then you can most definitely spin off when somebody talks about the end of the age.
It's a lot of material there.
Yeah. Lots to use here. So you get a lot in Reuben 6, you get phrases like the consummation of times, assuming that time is moving forward and there's going to be a fullness of time. Or the consummation of the age or the ages in Levi chapter 10. We'll go over some of these passages a little bit later. Or in Testament of Levi 1:1, it begins like this. So this would be the things that he's saying to Levi. Copy of the words of Levi, the things that he decreed to his sons concerning all that they were to do and the things that would happen to them until the day of judgment. And so the idea is that it's a preparatory, speech to prepare his children, for the rest of this age, culminating in the day of judgment or the inauguration of the next age.
Right. So the Testament of the Patriarchs is kind of a copy off of Genesis 49, where Jacob gathers before he dies. He gathers his 12 children. And so the Testament of the Patriarchs is a recounting of each of those 12 children gathering their kids before they die. And so, for example, Testament of Benjamin, chapter 10, it says, "You know then, my children, that I am dying." And so each of the 12 testaments kind of has the same idea as Genesis 49, just applied to the 12 instead of Jacob. So it says, "You know then, my children, that I'm dying. Do the truth, each of you to his neighbor. Keep the law of the Lord and his commandments. For I leave you these things instead of an inheritance. Give them then to your children for an eternal possession." This is what Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did. They gave us these things as an inheritance, saying, "Keep God's commandments until the Lord reveals his salvation to all the nations." And then you will see Enoch and Seth and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob being raised up at the right hand in great joy. Then shall we also be raised, each of us over our tribe, and we shall prostrate ourselves before the heavenly King. Then all shall be changed, some destined for glory, others for dishonor. For the Lord first judges Israel for the wrong she has committed, and then he shall do the same for all the nations. So you get kind of the taking of the historical narrative and then pushing it to its ultimate end and adding a whole bunch of messianic expectation and a lot of awesome stuff in there.
Yeah, man, that's incredible. This is just setting so much of the foundation for what the apostles are going to say in the New Testament. And I think there's consistency in the language here, like what you just read, John, in the Testament of Benjamin and what we see in the New Testament, because the apostles didn't need to invent new ideas and then use all this new language to go on to describe those new ideas. And I think specifically, I think of Romans 2. That totally connects with that last verse in what you read, John, where it said that the Lord is going to judge Israel first and then the nations. And so this is Romans 2, verse 9. Paul says there's going to be tribulation and distress for every human being who does evil, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. But glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. So really similar language and ideas right there in describing the order of judgment to the Jew first and then to the nations. And the other passage I think of is 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul is talking about the resurrection of the dead. And then he says this in verse 51. He says, "We shall not all sleep, but we shall be changed." And that's the exact same language you just read, John, in the Testament of Benjamin, chapter 10, verse 8. "We shall all be changed, some for glory and some for dishonor." Right, so I think this is just a great example that shows that Paul and the apostles are, again, not having to formulate new language, and they don't feel the need to come up with new expressions of speech or something for some kind of redefined or reimagined Jewish eschatology. They're just using the language and ideas from the Second Temple period to affirm apocalyptic eschatology.
Yeah, and I think even more than like the specific language is that the narrative is already there. So they're not pulling a new narrative or creating a new narrative. There's novelties, of course, in the New Testament, but the basic structure of the narrative of history, how they view the past, how they view the future, where it's going, that's all already part of, kind of common knowledge, expectation, consciousness. And so, when Jesus talks about Matthew 19, I tell you the truth, at the renewal of all things, when everything's changed and new heavens and new earth, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will sit on 12 thrones. And he's saying that as an encouragement to his disciples that have left everything, unlike the rich young ruler. And so, but that, like in Testament of Benjamin 10, when it says, then we shall also be raised, each of us over our tribe, that's the common expectation, is that there's a common narrative that is already kind of ingrained culturally at the time, and that's how they understood the 12 thrones, is that there would be a restoration of the 12 tribes in the Messianic kingdom at the day of God with the resurrection, the judgment, et cetera, et cetera.
That's great. The thing I like about this passage in Benjamin, the Testament of Benjamin, is it also reveals something else that I think just needs to be said over and over again, is that first century Jewish ideas were not ethnocentric, generally speaking. Certainly, sometimes that's the case, but generally speaking, and especially the worldview that these things are communicated in, they're not ethnocentric. It was a lot of the apocalyptic ideas of where the world was headed actually involve the nations. Like you have what you just read in Testament of Benjamin. They gave us all these things as an inheritance, saying Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, keep God's commandments until the Lord reveals his salvation to all the nations. So it was understood that looking backwards, so we're at the time of the Maccabees, and the time of the Maccabees is like the height of Jewish nationalism, right? Because there's such a threat of Hellenization, both by native Jews and also by outsiders being, trying to force Hellenize the community. And so the Maccabean revolt represents the height of Jewish nationalism. And even amidst that, the way that they're thinking about the being entrusted with the Torah has to do with God revealing his salvation to the nations. I think it's awesome. You also have passages like in the Testament of Levi of chapter 14, starting in verse 4, for what will all the nations do? So it's talking to Levi, right? Talking about being entrusted with the Torah again. What will all the nations do if you become darkened with impiety? You will bring down a curse on our nation because you want to destroy the light of the law which was granted for you for the enlightenment of every man, teaching commandments that are opposed to God's just ordinances. And so the every man there, he's referencing the nations above. What will the nations do if you become darkened with impiety? So he's talking about the stewardship of the oracles. Because if you lose track of the oracles in the Torah, what hope is there for the nations? Because it's assumed that that is the goal of the stewardship there.
Yeah, and then, right after that in verse 8, it says, and thereafter the Lord himself will arise upon you the light of righteousness with healing and compassion in his wings, and he will liberate every captive of the sons of men from Beliar, and every spirit of error will be trampled down. He will turn all nations to being zealous for him, and you shall see God in a human form, he whom the Lord will choose. Jerusalem is his name. So you get, the nations are very much in view as far as the redemption of the heavens and the earth. They're not just, stuck in a little bubble, that they want to see Rome cast off or whatever particular situation they're in. they're incorporating the prophetic literature and the hope of a new heavens and new earth and the nations being judged and the incorporation, like Romans 15, where Paul quotes out of Deuteronomy, the Psalms, Isaiah 11, that the nations will be turned from their idolatry to worship the God of Israel.
That's good. And this really has to be emphasized because one of the most influential movements in New Testament studies is the new perspective on Paul. And even if you've never heard the term, you've heard the concepts for a while now. And one of the most bizarre assumptions, well, it's not bizarre. It underlies the entire framework. But one of the assumptions is that this worldview, this kind of apocalyptic worldview, the reason it was kind of, in some frameworks it was overturned, and in other frameworks it was realized spiritually, like in N.T. Wright. But the point is what had to be overturned is because this concept of Jewish election and this concept of an apocalyptic eschatology was essentially ethnocentric for the New Perspective camp. Like, it all revolved around God only loves Israel. And that's not what they thought at all. And so they kind of want to package everything together so that they can throw all of it out in the name of, Jewish nationalism and pride. But that's just not what is going on. As we just read several of these passages here, their concept for Jewish election, at least in some circles, I'm sure there was some Jewish nationalism going on. But again, at the time when this is written, around the Maccabean revolt, the height of Jewish nationalist zeal, this is still the way that they're thinking about being entrusted with the oracles and with the commandments, is to be a light to the nations, because the time is coming when the Lord will turn all the nations to be zealous for him. That's just beautiful.
Right, and the books of Enoch are the same way, about the time of the Maccabean revolt, and you just don't even get a hint of kind of late first century zealotry that is, a lot of books and film and movies will kind of portray all of Judaism as what it was about the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And that's just not how it is. Right. Basically, the Zealot movement didn't even form in an official way until like the 50s, mid-50s, late 50s. And so you get kind of an over-reading of a particular time right before the destruction of Jerusalem back into all of the historical context of the New Testament, which is just not actually there in any of the historical documents.
And I will say here, too, just because if you're familiar at all with the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, there are a handful of what sometimes you call Christian interpolations. So again, generally written quite 150 years or so before the birth of Jesus. But there's a lot of, especially like kind of Trinitarian ideas that are just kind of randomly inserted. And so you read them and they read a little bit funny. Like here, and we shall see God. Most likely, that's where the phrase ended originally. He whom the Lord will choose, Jerusalem is his name. And so the inhuman form likely is an addition. And you just get used to it. There's just a handful of those in the Patriarchs, in the Testament of the Patriarchs. But there's two ways to read that. You go, man, those Christians are trying to corrupt texts. Or you go, okay, so apparently there's some Christian leaders who thought that these texts were really valuable, and other Christians at the time were probably going to be reading them. Right. And so whether it was their best moment or not, they decided to add a little bit to the text to kind of emphasize the way they were, the things that were being emphasized about Jesus at the time. But the point was that they valued the text, and that's the only reason to even add interpolations there.
Right.
Right. Like 4 Ezra is the same way, where you have a Christian introduction and conclusion tacked on, before and after. And the point is it's because Second Temple Judaism was the framework within which they understood the coming of Jesus, his death, resurrection, and his return.
Yeah.
And so it fit very well for them to take a Jewish text that was written before the time and add to it and put in that Jesus is the expected Messiah.
Right.
Not in such a way that he's fulfilling it or realizing it or reinterpreting it, but in line with it, within the same narrative of history.
Yeah, that's good. Well, yeah, Bill, you make some great points there specifically about how the Testaments are laying out Israel's election for the sake of the rest of the nations. I think something else we can see from the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs include themes that are common in the New Testament, like resurrection and the day of judgment at the end of the age, right?
Yep.
Yeah, a real well-known chapter would be the Testament of Levi, chapter 18. And so here's kind of the end of Levi's testament, where he's telling about the future, the days to come in his exhortation to his children. And so basically, most of the testaments have the same kind of framework, where they're long exhortations about ethical righteousness. And then at the end, they kind of have prophetic declarations about the end of the age. So Levi's has this where, at the end, the Lord's going to raise up a new priest who's going to execute judgment on the earth. He'll have the light of knowledge. And he says, this is the one, verse 4, that will shine forth like the sun in the earth. He shall take away all darkness from under heaven, and there shall be peace in all the earth. The heavens shall greatly rejoice in his days, and the earth shall be glad. The clouds will be filled with joy. The knowledge of the Lord will be poured out on the earth like the waters of the sea. The angels of glory of the Lord's presence will be made glad by him. The heavens will be opened, and from the temple of glory sanctification will come upon him. Down to verse 10, and he shall open the gates of paradise and remove the sword that has threatened since Adam. And he will grant the saints to eat of the tree of life. The spirit of holiness shall be upon them, and Beliar will be bound by him. And he shall grant to his children the authority to trample on wicked spirits, and the Lord will rejoice in his children. He'll be pleased by his beloved ones forever. Then Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will rejoice, and I shall be glad, and all the saints shall be clothed in righteousness.
Oh, I love
Amen.
that.
Let's stand. That's good.
I love that. I mean, it totally makes me think of a passage like Jesus' words in Matthew 8, verse 11, like when he says, I tell you, many will come from the east and the west and recline at table with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Totally a reference directly to that language, but again, as you said earlier, John, not just to the language, but to the existing concepts and the existing framework that the Tanakh was laying out, that the Testament of Levi is just building and developing upon and framing apocalyptically.
Yeah, another one that kind of represents that expectation of judgment, resurrection at the end of the age is the Testament of Zebulun. If you haven't caught on yet, so it's like all the children of Jacob. Testament of Zebulun, starting chapter 10, verse 1. And now, my children, do not grieve because I'm dying, nor be depressed because I'm leaving you. I shall rise again in your midst as a leader among your sons. And I will be glad in the midst of my tribe, as many as keep the law of the Lord and the commandments of Zebulun their father. But the Lord will bring down fire on the impious, and will destroy them to all generations. I am now hurrying to my rest like my fathers. So you have there like the anticipation of not only resurrection, but of, an ultimate judgment on the impious or the wicked, which is essentially kind of how elders would exhort, in terms of how like somebody, like a younger child would deal with things like the injustice in the world, is that it's awaiting a a future judgment, because at the time when he's raised from the dead, then the Lord will bring down fire on the impious and will destroy them to all generations. So I love how those things are connected together, kind of just as he's imparting wisdom to his son.
I think a great example of kind of the hermeneutical approach of the apocalyptic hermeneutical approach of Jews at the time is seen in Testament of Judah, at the end of the Testament of Judah. And so the same way that you have in Genesis 49, where Jacob is prophesying over Judah, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until tribute comes to him. And you get different translations, and to him be the obedience of all the peoples or nations. So you get different translations of that in the Septuagint, but you get that verse in particular that gets kind of infused with messianic and apocalyptic expectations. So in Testament of Judah, at the end of the Testament of Judah, he says, "After this there shall arise from you a star from Jacob in peace, and a man shall arise from my posterity like the Son of Righteousness, walking with the sons of men in gentleness and righteousness, and in him will be found no sin. And the heavens will be opened upon him, and pour out the Spirit as a blessing of the Father. And he will pour the Spirit of grace on you, and you shall be sons in truth, and you will walk in his first and final decrees. This is the shoot of God, the Most High. This is the fountain for the life of all humanity. Then he will illuminate the scepter of my kingdom, and from your root will arise the shoot, and through it will arise the rod of righteousness for the nations, to judge and to save all that call on the Lord. And after this, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will be resurrected to life, and I and my brothers will be chiefs, wielding our scepter in Israel." And then he goes on to list all 12, which kind of represents the resurrection and the restored 12 tribes. But Judah 24, you get a great example where you get kind of a weaving of the prophetic literature, particularly Isaiah 11, along with an extrapolating of Genesis 49 and the prophecy about Judah, extrapolating that kind of to its ultimate end with the coming of the Messiah and kind of a real high messianic expectation associated with the day of God, the resurrection, etc.
Yeah, that's good. So, like we tried to say at the beginning, some of the language that you get in the New Testament, a lot of the language that you get in the New Testament, at least a lot of the significant language that you get in the New Testament with Jesus and the apostolic writings, is not new or novel to the New Testament. There certainly are a couple things that are new. That hopefully that goes without saying. But generally, a lot of the language that's used it kind of betrays that, like John said at the beginning, the way that they thought about history and the world and the covenant and election and what was to come in the future and how it was going to get there, those things are established in their mind. Those things are without, those things are not rivaled in the New Testament. And so like, You may notice in passages like Matthew 12, there's a bunch of them, but Matthew 12, whoever speaks a word against the Son of Man will be forgiven, but whoever speaks against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven, either in this age or in the age to come. You notice how nobody there is questioning what he's talking about when he talks about two ages. But you don't find that language in the Tanakh. What you do is you find it in years and centuries of meditation on the Tanakh by Jewish leaders who then kind of began to talk about it in terms of two ages. Because some things that the Tanakh speaks about, this age simply isn't suitable. It's not a suitable place for those things to happen. And so eventually it just becomes assumed what's going to happen is there's going to be an age to come, and then many of the things were either placed at the end of this age, many of the expectations were at the end of this age, and others in the age to come. And so this is kind of how the concepts related to what we would call apocalyptic eschatology developed. And it's native not only in the language of Second Temple Judaism, but it's native to the authors of the New Testament too.
Right. And as time kind of develops after the New Testament, 3-4 centuries later, you get kind of a reshifting to the way Jews thought at the time becomes the background instead of the framework. And so here, you know, like you read in Matthew 12, there's a common framework and there's a criticism of fellow Jews within that framework. And so Jesus is basically functioning as a revivalist or a renewalist within that common expectation. But then later on, the narrative changes, and then Jesus is criticizing something Jewish that becomes the background against which he's saying something, a fundamentally different narrative, which goes back to our Kindle Solon episode, where if what Jews believed at the time is background versus some sort of new foreground, then you have a supersessionist thing happening. And that becomes kind of the playbook that happens over and over for the next 1,700 years of Christian theology in relation to the God of Israel, is some sort of new story that's being initiated that replaces the old one.
Right, where Christian theology kind of develops on this plane of it's the background, and so Christian theology is always in a zero-sum game with Jewish theology.
Right.
And so that's why even right now you start to talk about a hope for Israel, and half of the Christian world will look at you like, "Do you wear a yarmulke? do you do anything on Saturday? What's going on here?" And as though like you believe in a hope for Israel, and there's some sort of apostasy involved,
right?
Because it's Christian theology made it a zero-sum game. Either the background wins or Jesus wins. Both can't win.
Yep.
Right.
This is the sad history that we all know too well.
Well, yes, but I think you know, studying this literature and coming to terms with it as inspirational work that Jews looked to at the time. Obviously, they didn't view it as inspired like canon, but like we view modern inspirational works, that it reflects and gives us an idea about what they're thinking or their kind of mindset of the world and history and the future. That then we can look at the New Testament and say, well, how did they look at the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible? Probably the same way that other Jews looked at the Tanakh and the Bible at the time.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, guys. Well, with all of this said, I know we mentioned him earlier when you were talking about Matthias Henze, Bill, but the book that he wrote called Mind the Gap is a really, really helpful book. Just a basic introduction to Second Temple literature. I know we've recommended it before, but I figured, hey, let's talk about it again since we mentioned his name earlier in the episode. It's called Mind the Gap, and you can find a link to it on the resources page on our website, apocalypticgospel.com. Well, I think today, guys, this has been super helpful. Listeners, we hope it's been helpful and encouraging to you as well, just to be able to see the framework for the apocalyptic narrative in the New Testament, how it wasn't changed or altered or redefined or reimagined, but simply affirmed. And so moving forward in our season 3 here on the Tanakh, we want to begin to talk about Moses. We're going to spend several episodes talking about Sinai, Moses, how it plays out and is understood by the Second Temple authors and then the New Testament authors as well. But with that said, John, Bill, great to be with you guys today. And listeners, thanks again for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. God bless and Maranatha.
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 Thanks for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. For more, visit us on our website at apocalypticgospel.com and follow us on Twitter at Apocalyptic Gospel.